Alright, hey guys, here's our next video. It's these page numbers. There's a lot to go over, so I'm going to try to talk kind of fast, not make this too long. So, last reading, we talked about Washington's presidency, but we didn't get to the end of it. So let's think about the farewell address that he issues right before he leaves office. So, first off, he argued that Americans should not invest themselves or take a side in European affairs. Remember going back to his proclamation of neutrality during his presidency. And he also, even more importantly, spoke against the dangers of factions or parties. And we know right away from what we're about to talk about that this definitely doesn't happen. We're seeing a lot of political division between the Federalists and the Republicans. And again, it's important to realize he steps down after 2 terms, right? So he establishes a precedent for this that is not broken until Franklin Roosevelt serves almost 4 terms in the mid-20th century. Okay, so let's talk about the election of John Adams. So first off, he is the same party as Washington. He was also a Federalist. The election of 1796 really frames, though, this rise of political parties. The Republicans are challenging the Federalists with putting Thomas Jefferson on the ballot, and they come really close. So right away we're seeing that they're not listening to Washington's farewell address, that they're already forming these 2 different parties. Adams also won by a very narrow margin, again, showing a lot of partisanship there. And Jefferson actually became vice president because at that time, the runner-up, even if he was a different party, actually became vice president. We're going to see that change soon. Okay, Adams faced a lot of challenges during his presidency. He was actually only a 1-term president. There were a lot of reasons why. First off, there was a lot of tension with both France and Britain. I want to zero in on the tension with France. So first, there was this event called the Xyz Affair. Essentially, we were seeing the French, just like the British, were seizing American goods in the high seas, and also a treaty between the 2 of them needed to be renegotiated. So American diplomats were sent to Paris to try to negotiate with the French, and they were met with 3 French diplomats who immediately demanded a bribe from the Americans before they'd even speak to them. And they were nicknamed X, Y, and Z, hence the name of this affair. Adams actually gained some popularity here because he refused to even entertain the idea of bribing the French. He saw this as a sign of French corruption. And even though the French did not get their bribes, there was an unofficial war between France and America at this time. It was called the Quasi-War with France. It was basically a lot of fighting on the high seas, but no formal declaration of war. The biggest challenge to Adams's presidency was with the passage of the Alien and Sedition Acts. So first, going back to this tension with other countries, right? The Alien Act in particular was a response to anti-foreign sentiment, especially with the tensions with France, but also there was a growing resentment between the Federalists and the Republicans, right? So this was multiple things in one law. We'll first talk about the Alien part of the law, right? This is referring to immigrants. So the Alien and Naturalization Act lengthened the residency requirement to become a U.S. citizen. It used to be only 5 years, and then you could get naturalized. Then it became 14, which is actually still the case now. So essentially it made it harder to become a U.S. citizen. But it was actually aimed specifically at the French. The Americans, or rather the Federalist Party, which was in control at this time, were anti-French in general, and they didn't want French immigrants to move to the United States and become Americans. They didn't really think that they would be loyal. The Sedition Act was even more controversial because it restricted free speech by forbidding the writing or speaking out against the government. It was arguably targeted specifically against the Republicans, also known as Jeffersonians. The Federalists basically argued that any disagreement with the Adams administration was the same as treason, but the Republicans deeply opposed that. And so the Republicans ended up responding to it with these things called the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Virginia and Kentucky, both southern states, both largely Republican in nature. Remember, Jefferson is from Virginia. So they advocated for states to be able to nullify, or also we could call it declare null and void, laws they deemed unconstitutional, right? So basically, Virginia and Kentucky resolutions just ignored the Alien Sedition Acts. This actually sets a really important precedent moving forward. This sort of shows us this battle between the preference for a government that favors strong states' rights and a preference for a government that is more centralized, right? A stronger federal government. Even though, slavery is a major cause of the Civil War, there was also this tension between stronger states' rights advocates and stronger federal government's advocates. But just so we are clear, slavery is entangled in all of that. But we'll talk about that much more when we get closer to the Civil War. Okay, so just talking briefly about the turnover in 1800, the election of 1800. It's called a revolution, and I put it in quotes because it wasn't a violent revolution. Instead, it was basically the first political turnover from one party to the next in the White House. Remember, Adams was a Federalist, and Jefferson, who replaces him, is a Republican. Realize Adams, was a one-term president because he became increasingly unpopular after the Alien and Sedition Acts, and Jefferson was one of the main opponents of that. And Jefferson nearly won the election of 1796 anyway, so it wasn't that much of a surprise. Note how much sectionalism we see here too. Note that most of the urban population, these states closer to the coast, went towards Adams, and the more rural states went towards Jefferson. That's not at all a surprise. And another upshot of this election is that the 12th Amendment was ratified, and what that did was it allowed voters to vote for both the president and the vice president, because remember that Adams's vice president was actually Jefferson. So we had a vice president and a president in two different political parties. So the 12th Amendment stops that, and now every time we vote for president, we're voting for, a vice president and a president at the same time on the same ticket. Okay, so I want to talk about this landmark Supreme Court decision during Jefferson's presidency. It was called Marbury versus Madison. So just to give you some context, Adams was on his way out of the White House. He was in what's called his lame duck period. So he had been elected out of office, but Jefferson had not yet been sworn in. But Adams still appointed new federal judges. They were called midnight appointments because Adams was on his way out. And ultimately, before the judges were able to start their jobs, they had to be delivered commissions, hiring papers. So it was the job of James Madison to deliver these papers, but he refused to deliver the hiring papers to one of the appointees, this guy William Marbury. So Marbury sued Madison because he wanted this job. This lawsuit went up to the Supreme Court, and the court ended up ruling two contrasting things. On the one hand, it ruled it did not have the authority to make Madison deliver Marbury his hiring papers, but also in the process, it argued that it had the power to interpret the constitutionality of a law. They were striking down what was called the Judiciary Act of 1789. So what this gave the Supreme Court was one of its most important powers. It's called judicial review. Again, basically, it allows the court to determine whether or not a law is constitutional, and it made the Supreme Court a much more powerful branch of government. So if you take AP Gov, you will study that in more detail. Let's talk about westward expansion a little bit under Jefferson. So Jefferson very much wanted to acquire the Louisiana Territory from France to have control over the Mississippi River and to continue to expand west and also to be able to trade with the French port city of New Orleans. So Napoleon actually was pretty happy about selling this territory to the United States because they were quickly losing money from the Haitian Revolution. So the U.S. got a bargain for this. They purchased the Louisiana Territory for only $15 million, and it effectively doubled the size of the United States. But Jefferson was criticized for this because he basically had no constitutional authority to actually purchase all this land. And remember that there was this whole debate about whether or not Alexander Hamilton had the authority by the Constitution to establish a bank. And Jefferson was one of the biggest critics of Hamilton for that. But nonetheless, Jefferson loosely interpreted the Constitution, and the United States gained the Louisiana Territory. In order to survey this land, Jefferson sent an expedition to look at it. It was led by veterans Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. And the expedition basically mapped out the area, discovered some of the wildlife, and it was rather successful, and it also cemented the idea for further expansion all the way to the West Coast. We'll talk about that much more, manifest destiny. But it wouldn't, sort of the other players that are really important, it would not have been successful if it wasn't for Sacagawea helping them navigate the territory. She was a teenage pregnant Shoshone woman. And then also, something that isn't even mentioned in the textbooks was the role of York, who was one of Clark's slaves. He was the only black person on the Lewis and Clark expedition. And despite York's really important role, he actually did a lot of the hunting for the expedition. He was not granted his freedom by Clark for decades afterwards. So again, really important what the history textbooks leave out sometimes. Last slide. We're almost done. Okay, so let's talk about how slavery is still very much embedded in American politics, and also there's this continued general sort of kicking the can down the road when it comes to having discussions about ending slavery. So realize, first of all, even though Jefferson did win the election of 1800, if it weren't for the 3/5 clause, he probably would have lost. A lot of that is because southern states got more electoral votes because of the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. Congress also basically avoided having any real discussions about emancipation, and actually it made it even more difficult for enslaved persons to gain their freedom because they passed a new law that strengthened the Constitution's fugitive slave clause. Let's talk about two really important events also that show the growing fear of the desire for freedom, right? So one of them took place in Haiti. You might be familiar with this from your freshman year class, right? In Haiti, there was a rebellion among the enslaved population against the French. Haiti used to be a French colony, and they successfully gained their independence in 1804. And one of the reasons why a lot of white Americans were taking note of this was the person who led the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture. He was, you see him even dressed in Western style clothing, very, he's dressed sort of like as a French military officer here. He also, you see, he's holding a piece of paper. He was literate. And in general, there was a fear of Americans that if Black people were educated and literate, they'd be more inclined to fight for the liberties that were instilled in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. What's ironic about this is that the Jeffersonians supported the French in the French Revolution, but they were horrified at what they saw in the Haitian Revolution. So we can kind of ask the question, well, in general, the Jeffersonians seem to support liberty, but for whom, right? When the Haitians sought their independence, why did the Jeffersonians not support that? Another reason why white Americans feared the events in Haiti was because many Haitians actually ended up moving to the United States to try to escape the violence there. And white Americans were threatened by their presence because they were free, right? In the American South, in Virginia specifically, let's look at Gabriel Prosser's, I'm going to put it in quotes, rebellion, and I'll tell you why I'm putting it in quotes in a second. Again, it also demonstrated American fear of Black freedom and liberty. Gabriel Prosser was an enslaved, literate blacksmith, and he planned a rebellion to march to Richmond, Virginia, stage a rebellion and attempt to gain his freedom. But the rebellion was never executed because the plans leaked, and the conspirators, including Gabriel Prosser himself, were arrested and hanged, right? So it's ironic that it's even called a rebellion, which is why I put it in quotes, because it never happened. It was just a plan for a rebellion. And again, this demonstrates white fear that the Black population was going to seek the liberty that was established by the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In particular, white Americans were really afraid of Black people that could read, right? Because these documents that I just referred to were talking about liberty, talking about the ideas that all men were created equal. They were afraid that they would use these words against them, right? Which they did. We already saw that in the grievances of enslaved persons that we talked about in Unit 2, right? So they're pointing out the hypocrisy of these documents. So Gabriel Prosser's quote-unquote rebellion also resulted in Virginia enacting stricter laws to limit the freedom of movement of the Black population. So we're seeing an increasing element of fear that's going to make it much more difficult for Black Americans to gain any sense of freedom. Even free Blacks did not have the same rights as white people, right? They were not able to move about in the same way. They weren't able to congregate. There were vagrancy laws. We'll get into that much more in future units. So this was probably long enough. Thank you for listening. I hope it was helpful, and I'll see you soon. Thanks.